Elia's cross wasn't the kind of man who bent the knee. Even in the face of death, even when surrounded by enemies, he stood tall, as if the very ground beneath his feet had been carved out of stone. His reputation preceded him in the galaxy, an impossible-to-break human soldier feared by every empire, but now in the grasp of the most powerful one of all, the Zaral Empire. The Queen of the Zaral had no use for prisoners who didn't beg. She had seen it all before: broken men. Defeated, terrified, begging for their lives as they lay at her feet. She had grown used to it, even pleased by it. It was a symbol of her might, of her absolute control. But Elia's cross wasn't like the others. He had been captured during a covert operation, thrown into the clutches of the Zaral Empire's finest. They had stormed his ship, overwhelmed his crew, and now here he was, a prisoner. But his defiance was all they saw. As Elias was brought into the throne room, the queen sat upon her golden seat, surrounded by her loyal guards. The throne room was vast, a place of cold, alien elegance. The walls were adorned with intricate designs of stars and dark matter, and the air smelled of expensive incense that lingered, thick with authority. The Zaral Empire was built on fear, and this room was its heart. Elias was shoved to the floor before the queen, his hands bound by thick, glowing chains. He could feel the weight of her gaze upon him, her piercing eyes scanning him from head to toe. She was regal, imposing, and utterly certain that no one could challenge her rule. But Elias, with his disheveled appearance and rugged demeanor, refused to show fear. His eyes locked with hers, unwavering. The queen's voice rang out, smooth and venomous, a tone that promised pain and suffering to those who did not obey. "Human," she began, "you are far from home. You've crossed into my domain, and now you will pay the price." She leaned forward slightly, the faintest smile curving her lips. "Beg for mercy, and I may consider sparing your life." Elias could feel the tension in the room, the silent anticipation. He was supposed to be broken, to beg and plead for his life. It was a formality to the queen, a game she played with every prisoner. But as her words hung in the air, Elias did something unexpected. He laughed. It wasn't a loud, mocking laugh, but a quiet, confident chuckle. The kind of laugh that suggested he had already won in some way, even though he was a prisoner. The queen raised an eyebrow, her smile faltering for a moment. "You laugh?" she asked, her voice turning colder. "Do you think this is a joke?" Elias lifted his head slightly, still grinning. "You think I'll beg for mercy? You think you can make me afraid of you?" The room went still. Even the guards, hardened, trained soldiers who had seen countless prisoners fall to their knees, shifted uncomfortably. The queen's eyes narrowed, her patience waning. "Perhaps you think you are untouchable," she said, her voice steady but edged with menace. "But every being in my empire knows the price of defiance. You will not be spared simply because you laugh. You are a prisoner, and prisoners beg." Elia's laughter faded, but his smirk remained. "I'm not a prisoner, not yet." He met her gaze with unwavering defiance. "I'm just a man who isn't afraid of you." The queen's guards exchanged uncertain glances. Elias could see the shift in their demeanor, the brief flicker of doubt in their eyes. It was as if they had never been faced with someone like him before, someone who did not cower, did not bow, and did not beg. The queen stood up suddenly, her movement sharp and commanding. She wasn't used to anyone challenging her, not even with words. She had grown accustomed to obedience, to the quiet, desperate pleas of those who feared her. But this human, this Elias Cross, was different. She looked at him, her gaze filled with both curiosity and fury. "You find this amusing?" she asked, her voice low, almost threatening. "I find you amusing," Elias replied without hesitation. His words were like a slap in the face to the queen's authority. "You sit on your throne expecting everyone to kneel before you, but you don't scare me." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The queen's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't speak for a moment. Instead, she signaled to her guards. Without a word, they stepped forward, preparing to subdue Elias. But before they could act, the queen raised a hand. "No, let him speak," she commanded. "If he believes himself to be untouchable, then let him show me." Elias could feel the guards' hands on his shoulders, the pressure of their strength, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall, every muscle in his body straining against the chains that bound him, but his spirit remained unbroken. "I'm not afraid of you," he repeated, his voice steady. "And I'm not begging, you can't break me." The queen's lips curled into a tight smile, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had seen many prisoners, broken many souls, and was confident she would break him as well. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You're a brave man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But bravery is not enough when faced with me." Elias didn't flinch. "Bravery is all I need," he said, "because unlike you, I don't need to break. I can stand tall no matter what." The queen stood still for a moment, as though contemplating her next move. There was a spark of something in her eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or the smallest hint of respect. But it was quickly replaced by something darker, something colder. "You may have spirit, human," she said finally, "but spirit doesn't save lives. It only leads to more suffering. Your life will end here in this very room, and you will not be remembered. You will be forgotten, just like all the others who came before you." Elias met her gaze unflinchingly. "We'll see." The queen turned on her heel and signaled to the guards. "Take him away," she ordered, her tone final. As Elias was dragged out of the throne room, he didn't look back. He had made his point. The queen had expected him to beg, to fall at her feet like all the others. But Elias Cross wasn't like all the others, and he wasn't about to make it easy for her. He was a human, and humans didn't beg, not for anyone, not for anything. As the heavy doors of the throne room closed behind him, Elias felt a small flicker of satisfaction. The queen had underestimated him, and that was her first mistake. Elias Cross woke up in a cold, damp cell. His body ached from the guards' rough handling as they dragged him from the throne room to the dungeons beneath the Zaral Empire's palace. The walls were made of dark stone, cold and unyielding. The air smelled of dampness and decay, and the only light came from a single flickering torch outside the bars of his cell. He was chained to the wall, his hands bound tightly, but his mind was free. The guards had underestimated him. The queen had underestimated him. They expected him to break under their pressure, to beg for mercy like all the others. But Elias wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid. He spent the first few hours in the silence of the dungeon, testing the chains, pulling at them, seeing if he could find any weakness. But there was none. They were secure, and there was no chance of escaping through the bars of the cell. But Elias wasn't focused on escape, not yet. His mind was focused on something much more important, how to get under the queen's skin. He knew the queen had been watching him, studying him. She expected him to beg. She thought he would break, but she was wrong. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for something more. He was fighting to show her that humans weren't like the other creatures she had ruled over. Humans didn't give up, didn't bend the knee. And Elias was the perfect example of that. As the hours passed, Elias began to think about his next move. He knew the queen would return, and when she did, she would expect him to be broken, to show some sign of weakness. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He would make her doubt herself, make her question her own power. The dungeon was quiet, save for the sound of the dripping water somewhere in the distance. Elias had been in worse places before. He had fought on distant planets, fought in battles that had seemed hopeless, and he had always survived. This wouldn't be any different. The chains might hold him physically, but they couldn't break his will. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had to stay calm. He had to think. Hours later, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Elias' eyes shot open, and he straightened up, his muscles tense. He could hear the guards' voices before they reached his cell. They were speaking in low tones, but Elias could make out the words. They were discussing how he had refused to beg, how he had laughed in the queen's face. It was clear they were still shaken by his defiance. When the guards finally arrived at his cell, they stopped in front of the bars. One of them, a large, burly Zaral soldier, spoke to Elias in a voice that was more curious than hostile. "You still haven't begged for mercy," the soldier said, his tone a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "The queen has broken every prisoner who has come before you, yet you laugh in her face." Elias didn't answer at first. He just stared at the guard, letting the silence stretch between them. He could see the doubt in the man's eyes, the hesitation. The guards weren't used to this. They weren't used to prisoners who didn't fear them. Finally, Elias spoke. "The queen thinks she can break me. But she's wrong. I'm not like the others. I don't beg for mercy. I don't fear death." The guard stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. "You're brave, but bravery doesn't save you in this empire. The queen's wrath is not something you want to face." Elias leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cold bars of his cell. "I'm not afraid of her," he said quietly. "She can kill me if she wants, but I won't beg." The guard looked conflicted for a moment, then turned away. Elias could hear his footsteps retreating down the hallway. He was alone again. But Elias knew he wasn't really alone. The seed of doubt had been planted. It was small, but it was there. The guard had seen something in him, something the queen hadn't expected. And that was just the beginning. For the next few days, Elias was left in the dungeon. He spent most of the time thinking, strategizing. He wasn't just planning for his escape. He was planning for something bigger. He was going to take down the Zarul Empire, and he would start with the queen herself. It was a risky plan, but it was the only one that made sense. He needed to get inside the queen's mind, make her question her own strength. And that started with the guards. The guards, those loyal servants of the queen, were the key. They were the ones who believed in her power, who feared her wrath, but Elias knew that fear could be turned into something else. Doubt, distrust. It was a small thing, but it was powerful. Elias began to test the guards. Whenever one came near his cell, he would speak to them, plant small seeds of doubt. He would remind them of how they had once been free, how they had once fought for their own people, and how they had chosen to serve the queen instead. He told them stories of human resistance, of warriors who had fought against overwhelming odds and won. He spoke of the human spirit, of how it could never be broken, no matter how strong the enemy. At first, the guards were skeptical. They didn't want to listen. But as the days passed, Elias noticed the change. The guards became less certain. They began to question the queen's motives, question their own loyalty. And when the queen's personal guard came to check on him, Elias saw the shift in their eyes. They no longer looked at him with disdain. They looked at him with something else, something that resembled respect. It was subtle, but it was there. And then, one day, it happened. Lyra, the queen's most trusted guard, came to visit Elias. Lyra was a tall, fierce woman with sharp features and cold eyes. She had been one of the queen's most loyal soldiers, known for her ruthlessness and her unshakable loyalty. But when she entered Elias' cell, there was something different about her. She was no longer the cold, unfeeling warrior she had once been. There was a crack in her armor, a small fracture that Elias had been waiting for. "Why do you resist?" Lyra asked, her voice low and cautious. "Why do you refuse to beg? Why do you laugh at the queen?" Elias met her gaze. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the uncertainty. "Because I know the truth," he said quietly. "I know that no matter how powerful she is, no matter how many guards she has, no matter how much control she thinks she has over me, she can't break me." Not without breaking herself. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him as if considering his words. After a long pause, she spoke again. "You're not like the others," she said, almost to herself. "You're not afraid." Elias didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his eyes steady. "I don't know what the queen will do to you," Lyra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you're not careful, she will destroy you. She will make you beg for your life, just like she has done with so many others." "I won't beg," Elias replied simply. "And neither will you." Lyra's eyes flickered as though she were contemplating something. Then, without another word, she turned and left the dungeon, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Elias sat back against the cold stone wall, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had planted the seed of doubt in Lyra's mind, and soon the rest of the guards would begin to question their loyalty. The queen's empire was built on fear, but fear was a fragile thing, and Elias had learned how to shatter it. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the dungeon grew heavier. Elias could feel the change in the air, the quiet murmurings of rebellion spreading among the guards. They were starting to see the queen for what she really was, someone who ruled not with strength but with fear. And fear, Elias knew, was the easiest thing to destroy. Soon, the queen would realize that her reign was already slipping through her fingers. And when the time came, Elias would be ready. Days turned into weeks in the cold, dark dungeons beneath the Zarul Empire's palace, and Elias Cross had learned how to make the silence his ally. The guards who once glared at him with contempt now looked at him with something else in their eyes, doubt. It had started with small things. Glances when they thought he wasn't looking, whispered words when they believed he couldn't hear. At first, Elias had simply watched, waiting for the right moment. He had planted the seeds of rebellion with just a few words, each one designed to unsettle them, to make them question the very foundation of the empire they had sworn to protect. It was working. Slowly, subtly, the guards were beginning to see the cracks in the queen's perfect image. They were beginning to realize that their loyalty to her wasn't about honor, it was about fear. Fear that Elias had already started to dismantle. But Elias wasn't done yet. He knew that the queen's control over her empire wasn't just about fear, it was about trust. The queen had surrounded herself with a network of loyalists, her personal guards, her advisors, and her spies. She kept them close, fed them lies, and made them believe that she was untouchable. But the truth was, the queen's empire was built on nothing but lies, and Elias had begun to unravel them one by one. He spent his days in the dungeon, always watching, always listening. He wasn't just waiting for the guards to make a mistake. He was waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew that the queen would eventually come to check on him. She would want to see if her power had broken him yet, to see if he had finally bent the knee and begged for mercy. But Elias wouldn't give her that satisfaction. He wasn't going to beg. He was going to make her beg. One afternoon, as Elias sat on the cold stone floor of his cell, his mind working through his plans, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor. The guards were coming, but this time, something felt different. The footsteps were heavier, more deliberate. Elias stood up and straightened his posture, his eyes fixed on the door. He had been waiting for this moment, and now it had finally arrived. The door to his cell creaked open, and Elias was met with the sight of Lyra, the queen's most trusted guard. She stood tall and imposing, her sharp features hard as stone. But there was something different in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. She wasn't the same cold, ruthless soldier who had brought him to the dungeon weeks ago. Now there was doubt in her eyes, and that made her dangerous. "Elias Cross," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of something else. "The queen has ordered that you be moved to a different cell. You've caused enough trouble in this one." Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a moment to study her, to see if he could read the emotions that flickered across her face. He could see the hesitation in her posture, the way she stood just a little too far away, as if she was afraid of something. He smiled slightly. "So the queen sends you herself, does she?" Elias asked, his voice calm, almost amused. "Is she afraid of me now?" Lyra didn't flinch. "The queen is never afraid," she replied, but Elias could tell by the way her words faltered that she wasn't so sure anymore. "You know, it's funny," Elias said, stepping closer to the bars of his cell. "I've been sitting here listening to all the whispers, and I've come to a conclusion. The queen's empire isn't strong because of her power. It's strong because you and your people are too afraid to see the truth." Lyra's jaw clenched, but she didn't respond. She was trying to maintain her composure, but Elias could see through it. She was struggling with something deep inside her that made her hesitate whenever she looked at him. "You know what's going to happen next, don't you?" Elias continued, leaning against the bars. "You're going to move me to a new cell, and you're going to report back to the queen. And she'll smile and think she's won. But the truth is, you're already questioning her. You're already wondering if all of this empire, this power, is really worth it. And when the time comes, when the queen is at her weakest, you'll have to decide whose side you're really on." Lyra's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Elias saw a flicker of fear in them. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there. The doubt had planted itself deep inside her mind, and Elias could see it spreading like a virus. "Shut up," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know anything about loyalty." Elias took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Loyalty is a lie," he said softly. "It's a cage they put you in, and once you're inside, you can't see the bars anymore. But I'm not in a cage, and I'm not going to be." The tension in the air was thick, and Elias could feel it settling over them like a weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the dungeon was the faint rustling of Lyra's armor as she shifted her weight, and the distant drip of water from the ceiling. Elias could see that she was thinking, processing his words. He had broken through the barrier of her resolve, and now all he had to do was push a little harder. "You think the queen is untouchable," Elias said, his voice low and calm. "You think she has control over everything, but I'm telling you she's not. Her empire is built on lies, and I'm going to bring it down, one step at a time." Lyra opened her mouth as if to say something, but before she could, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone else was coming. Elias could see the change in Lyra's expression as she stiffened, her hand moving to the weapon at her side. "Get ready," Elias said quietly, his eyes locked on hers. "You'll have to decide soon, Lyra. You'll have to choose whether to follow her or do what's right." Lyra didn't say anything. She just turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the distance. Elias stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had reached her, and now the path was clear. It wasn't just about escape anymore. It wasn't just about surviving. Elias was going to bring the entire Zarl Empire to its knees, and the queen would be the first to fall. Days passed, and Elias kept up his plan. He continued to speak to the guards, planting more seeds of doubt, pushing them to question everything they had ever believed in. It wasn't long before whispers started to spread through the palace. Guards who had once been loyal to the queen were beginning to speak in hushed tones about the human in the dungeon, the one who had refused to beg, who had laughed in the queen's face. And then, one evening, as Elias sat in his cell, the door opened again. This time it was Lyra who entered, but a group of guards, led by a tall figure who Elias recognized immediately. Talon, the queen's second-in-command. Talon had always been a cold, calculating man. He was the one who oversaw the queen's military operations, the one who kept the empire's enemies at bay. He was the queen's right hand, and he was feared by everyone in the palace. But when he looked at Elias, there was no fear in his eyes. There was only curiosity. And that Elias knew was a dangerous thing. "You've caused quite a stir," Talon said, his voice low and cold. "The queen is becoming concerned." Elias didn't respond right away. He just studied the man, waiting for him to continue. "We've heard the whispers," Talon said, his eyes narrowing. "The guards are starting to question their loyalty. They're beginning to doubt the queen's power, and it's all because of you." Elias smiled, a small, satisfied grin. "It's not just me, it's the truth. And the truth always has a way of getting out." Talon took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "The queen doesn't like things to get out of control, and she doesn't like you, but she's not a fool. She knows when someone is dangerous. And right now you are dangerous." Elias stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Talon's. "Dangerous? I'm not dangerous, I'm just telling the truth, and the truth is your queen is nothing but a scared little tyrant." Talon's expression darkened, but he didn't draw his sword. Instead, he turned and gestured to the guards. "Take him to the queen," he said coldly. "She wants to see him, and when she's done with him, we'll see how much danger he really is." Elias was ready. He had made it this far, and now the queen would finally see the truth. And when she did, she would understand that the empire she had built on lies was coming to an end. Elias had prepared himself for this moment, yet standing before the queen was different than he had imagined. The once mighty ruler of the Zarl Empire sat on her golden throne, surrounded by her guards, her eyes burning with fury. There was no sign of the calm, confident queen who had once controlled everything. Instead, there was only a woman who looked unsure of herself, who had begun to doubt her own empire. Elias stood before her, unchained for the first time in weeks. His wrists still bore the marks of the chains, but there was no sign of weakness in him. His eyes met the queen's, and for a moment there was nothing but silence between them. She expected him to fall to his knees to beg for his life, but Elias did not. He stood tall, unwavering, a symbol of defiance. The queen's lips curled into a tight smile, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had been beaten, who was trying to maintain control, but was already losing it. "You've been a problem from the moment we captured you, Elias Cross," she said, her voice laced with venom. "But I will make sure that your stubbornness does not go unpunished." Elias didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. He knew she would try to break him to make him beg. But the more she tried, the more she revealed just how weak she had become. "You think you can break me?" Elias said, his voice calm, steady. "You think you can make me fear you? You've underestimated me, and now you're underestimating the people who will bring your empire down." The queen's eyes narrowed, her face hardening. "You're nothing but a human, Elias. You think you can change anything? My empire is built on power. I will crush anyone who stands in my way." Elias smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You might have power, but you don't have control. You can't control the hearts of your people. You can't control the ones who have already begun to question you." The queen stood up from her throne, her sharp eyes never leaving Elias. She gestured to her guards, and they stepped forward, surrounding him. But Elias didn't move. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. "You've done something no one else has," the queen said, her voice cold, almost admiring. "You've made my own guards doubt me. You've made them question their loyalty, and that is something I will not tolerate." Elias raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "You think it's just the guards, don't you? It's not just them. It's everyone who's ever been under your rule. They're all starting to see you for what you are, a tyrant who rules with fear, not respect." The queen's face darkened. "You're wrong. They fear me because I am strong. I have crushed every rebellion, every uprising, and I will crush you as well." But Elias knew something the queen didn't. He knew that power built on fear was fragile, and once that fear began to crack, it could never be repaired. The queen had lost her control over the empire long before Elias had set foot in her palace. It had been a slow process, a series of small mistakes, of decisions that had slowly eroded her authority. And now, as the seeds of rebellion grew, Elias was the spark that would set the fire. "I'm not afraid of you," Elias said again, his voice steady and strong. "You can kill me, you can destroy me, but it won't change anything. The empire is falling. And you'll be the first to fall with it." The queen's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. It was brief, but it was there. For a moment, Elias saw the vulnerability behind the facade of power. He saw the fear that had been buried beneath her cold exterior, the fear that had driven her to control every aspect of her empire with an iron fist. "Your guards are already turning on you," Elias continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "You think they'll stand by you when the time comes? When the rebellion rises, when they realize they've been serving a dying cause, they'll abandon you just like the rest of your empire." The queen's eyes flashed with anger, but there was a hesitation in her step as she approached him. She was no longer the confident, untouchable ruler she had once been. She was a woman on the edge, grasping for control she could no longer maintain. "You speak as if you know everything, Elias," the queen said, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "But you don't. You don't know what it's like to be in my position, to hold the fate of billions in your hands." "I don't need to know," Elias replied calmly. "Because I know what it's like to fight for something bigger than yourself. I know what it's like to fight for freedom, for the truth, and that's something you'll never understand." The queen stepped back, her face turning pale. For the first time, she looked unsure of herself. Elias could see the weight of her years of rule catching up with her. She had built her empire on fear, and now that fear was turning against her. "You're nothing but a rebel," the queen spat, her voice filled with venom. "A human who thinks he can change the galaxy. You're just a fleeting moment, and when I'm done with you, no one will remember your name." Elias didn't react. He had already won. The queen's words were empty now. He had made her doubt herself, made her question everything she had built, and that was all he needed. "You'll be forgotten just like every tyrant before you," Elias said quietly. "Your empire will fall, and it will be remembered for nothing more than its cruelty. But me, I'll be remembered because I fought for something that mattered." For a moment, there was silence. The queen stood before him, her face twisted in rage, but there was a crack in her armor, a crack that Elias had created, and through that crack he could see the beginning of the end. "You may think you've won," the queen said, her voice low, trembling, "but you haven't. You've only delayed the inevitable. I will have you killed, and no one will ever know your name." Elias smiled, a quiet, satisfied smile. "You're wrong, you're already forgotten. And when the galaxy looks back on your reign, all they'll see is a tyrant who couldn't hold on to the power she thought she had." With that, the queen turned and walked away, her guards following close behind. Elias watched her leave, knowing that her time was up. The empire she had built on fear was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of the galaxy saw it too. As the heavy doors of the throne room closed behind him, Elias felt a strange sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, not yet. But he had done what he set out to do. He had shown the queen that her power was nothing without the support of her people. And now, the rest of her empire would soon see the truth. The rebellion had begun, and Elias' cross was its spark.